My name is Amanda Opitz, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the YWCA, and I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, Anya Jabour. Anya is a professor of history and the co-director of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Montana. She's also the coordinator of the University of Montana Women's Suffrage Centennial Committee and a member of an advisory board for the Montana Historical Society's Women's History Matters project. So everyone, please help me welcome Professor Anya Jabour.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Thank you for braving the parking situation. In honor of Christmas, I showed up in red, and then Amanda very nicely provided me with a green water glass. So we are here in the spirit of the season. Just to give you a little bit of background on this project, as Amanda mentioned, I was part of an ad hoc group called the Montana Women's Suffrage Centennial Committee here in Missoula, which was created in late 2013 in order to celebrate the centennial of Montana women's suffrage in 2014. And we did a number of projects, most notably putting together a traveling exhibit that has been on display here in Missoula at the Bonn, the Missoula Public Library, and at the Mansfield Library on campus. Anyone seen it? Okay, a couple people. And it's currently touring the state. By the end of this month, it will have been to more than 30 communities in Montana and will have reached more than 30,000 Montanans. So we're very excited about that project, which was funded by Humanities Montana. So what I'm going to do today is talk about 4 women who are featured in that exhibit. So if you've already seen the exhibit, you may have seen these people's names. You'll get to learn a little bit more about them. If you haven't seen the exhibit, you'll get some sense of what it was about by the focus on these 4 particular women. Before I begin, I also want to add that both the exhibit itself and this talk were prepared with the assistance of a former graduate student of mine, Kayla Blackman, who has since graduated and now has relocated to the Boston area, but who nonetheless deserves credit for her many contributions to this project. So I want to begin with Helen Clark. Helen Clark was the Eastern educated daughter of a Blackfeet mother and a Scottish-American father. During her lifetime, she gained powerful political positions as first a school superintendent and later as an allotment official. But neither white nor Native society ever fully accepted her. Born in 1846 in present-day Fergus County, Clark grew up at a time of rapid change for Montana's Native population. As the non-Native population grew, so too did tensions between Montana's original residents and its white newcomers. Clark's family was caught up in these violent conflicts in 1869 when her father was murdered by his wife's cousin, possibly in retribution for horse stealing. The U.S. Army subsequently led a campaign against the Blackfeet that culminated in the Marias Massacre, in which 173 Blackfeet were slaughtered. Hoping to bring an end to the hostilities, the Blackfeet, along with the other tribal nations of Montana, negotiated treaties with the United States for reservation land set aside for tribal use. The reservation system, while problematic for all Native Americans, was particularly difficult for Indian women. Each reservation was under the control of a male government agent who had authority over the allocation of food. This was an authority traditionally reserved for women in Native society, so federal agents' control of food undermined women's authority at the same time that it subjected them to daily hardship. Iron Teeth, an elderly Northern Cheyenne woman, complained, "The government promised to feed us if we would live on the reservations, but I am given very little food." As an adolescent and a young woman, Helen Clark was somewhat sheltered from these developments. Prior to his death, her father had sent her to a convent school in Ohio. After briefly returning to Montana in the 1860s, Clark again left the territory after her father's murder, first staying with her father's sister in Minneapolis and then moving to New York City, where she became a successful actress. This image dates from that period of her life. But in 1875, at the age of 29, Clark decided to return to Montana. Clark's homecoming was complicated by increasing racial prejudice. The mid-1870s were another period of heightened racial tensions in Montana. Women played an important and ongoing role in the conflicts between federal officials and Native people. Among the Northern Cheyenne, one woman, Buffalo Calf Road woman, not only fought alongside male warriors at the Battle of the Rosebud River in 1876, but also saved her brother's life, so that her comrades actually named the battle for her, Battle Where the Girl Saved Her Brother. If you look closely at this image, these obviously are the federal officers with their guns. This is Buffalo Calf Road woman. Her brother's nose and chin are poking out from the other side of the horse where he is taking shelter from the federal bullets. A week later, Buffalo Calf Road woman became the only woman to fight against General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, earning the honorary name Brave Woman. Helen Clark, however, took a different path. Taking advantages of her father's connections, she cast her lot with the white elite rather than with Native resistance. Clark's experiences in the 1880s revealed the complexities of mixed blood status in Montana. Although a white friend of her father's helped Clark get a job in the Helena school system, Helena's white society ladies, such as Elizabeth Chester Fisk, shunned Clark. Indeed, Lizzie Fisk even withdrew her children from the city's schools because she did not want what she called a half-breed Indian teaching her children. Other white Montanans, however, were impressed by Clark's excellent credentials. She had a thorough classical education as well as being well-versed in Shakespeare and was a gifted public speaker. In 1882, with the support of those Montanans, Clark became the first woman elected to public office in Montana, becoming the superintendent of schools for Lewis and Clark County. She was so popular in that role that she was subsequently elected to a second and then to a third term. However, in 1887, the year after Clark was elected to her third term, the U.S. Congress passed the Dawes Act, also known as the Allotment or Severalty Act. This act divided up communal tribal lands and assigned or allotted tracts to individual Indian families. It also authorized the sale of so-called surplus land to non-Indians, creating a checkerboard pattern of Indian and non-Indian land ownership on reservations. If you drive more north of Missoula up to toward the Flathead, this is a very distinctive pattern you'll notice there. This is how it originated. The intention of the allotment system was to assimilate Native Americans into Anglo-European society by pressuring them to give up communal use of land and adopt an Anglo method of family farming. The allotment system, again, like the reservation system, had particular consequences for women. Allotments favored male heads of household. For instance, the Fort Peck Reservation, which was allotted between 1908 and 1913, was divided into 320-acre plots, which were awarded to adult males. The remainder of the land was declared surplus and offered to white homesteaders. Notice that adult females, Native females, were not included in this scenario at all. Again, this represented not only a sort of a loss of economic opportunity, but also a decline in women's status. Working the land was traditionally women's work in Native society as well. So shifting land ownership from women to men reduced women's autonomy. As the Sioux chief Sitting Bull pointed out, if men would work the land, then the women will be stripped of all which gave them power. For Helen Clark, however, allotment provided another opportunity for gainful employment. In 1890, she became the first and only individual of Native ancestry to be appointed as a U.S. allotment agent. While mixed-blood people in general encountered increasing prejudice in white society, U.S. officials believed that Clark's ancestry would make her an effective agent. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs speculated, being identified with the Indian race, it is probable that she would be able to exert a greater influence with them than one who was not so identified. And this image here comes from Helen Clark's work at one of the several places where she worked as an allotment agent. This particular image comes from Oklahoma. However, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs misjudged the situation. In fact, Native men, angered by Clark's attempts to persuade them to submit to allotment, complained that a mere woman did not have the authority for that kind of work. Clark's own condescending views toward her fellow Indians only exacerbated the situation, as she complained to the commissioner, "I am working among a people whose very soul abominates anything tending towards civilization. And they are bright enough to see that allotments mean civilization ultimately. And because of this fact, they have shown a bitterness unparalleled." Despite her difficulties, Clark continued to work with the federal government. "I'm a struggling woman without fortune," she explained. "I want to remain in this work of allotting lands until I can save enough to live on in my old age." By the early 1900s, however, Clark had completed her work as an allotment agent. After unsuccessfully attempting to gain another post as an allotment agent, Clark again returned to Montana, now in her mid-50s. Once again, she quickly became embroiled in conflicts between the federal government and the Blackfeet people. But this time, she sided with the Blackfeet, orchestrating a campaign, ultimately a successful campaign, to remove a reservation agent who had attempted to force assimilation on the Blackfeet by withholding rations. It's a really complicated story here. In 1907, allotment began on the Blackfeet Reservation. No longer viewed as a desirable allotment agent herself because of her ancestry, Clark now petitioned to become an allotment target herself, choosing a site just east of what would become Glacier National Park. To gain title to the land, Clark had to present evidence of her native heritage, testifying that her mother had been a full-blood Blackfeet. She also confronted the same sorts of racial prejudice that she herself had been guilty of in earlier years, when she was required to testify on oath that she was both sober and competent. So the creation of Glacier National Park curtailed Native people's use of the land for hunting, fishing, and gathering. And many Blackfeet adapted to this situation by catering to the tourist trade, as this Blackfoot telephone operator is doing in Glacier. In many cases, the way that Blackfeet adapted was to play Indian for the benefit of tourists, as these Blackfeet in full regalia are shown doing. Interestingly, there's also a black Pullman porter in the background there, one of the most prestigious, honorable jobs available to African American men at the time. Anyway, now, fully invested in her Indian identity, and frankly, with not a whole lot of alternatives, Clark, like these Indians represented here, eked out a living by catering to the white tourists who came to the park. No longer representing the federal government, in her final decades, Clark presented herself as a genuine Indian in order to reap the benefits of the tourist trade. Helen Clark died in 1923 at the age of 76. Her entire life had been profoundly shaped by her mixed heritage and by conflicts between the federal government and Montana's tribes. Her choices also were constrained by her gender, her family connections, and her financial need. According to one acquaintance, whatever her own opinions, she could only serve her people by counseling them to submit, make the best of the situation, and so educate themselves that they might meet the whites on their own ground, and finally, possibly, to obtain justice. The year after Helen Clark's death, in 1924, American Indians finally gained U.S. citizenship and voting rights. So I'm guessing Helen Clark may be a new acquaintance for some of you, whereas Jeanette Rankin may feel like an old friend. Here she is pictured at the headquarters of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, also known as NASA. Remember that, there will not be a quiz, but I'm not going to say National American Woman Suffrage Association every time again. just outside of Missoula on June 11, 1880, Jeanette Rankin was the oldest of 7 children. After attending Missoula public schools, she graduated from the Montana State University, which is now the University of Montana, in 1902 with a degree in biology. So she's shown here sorting and labeling biological samples. Rankin was intelligent and ambitious, and in particular, she wanted to travel. In later life, she recalled that in her journal that she kept when she graduated college, which she unfortunately subsequently destroyed, she had written these words of instruction to herself: go, go, go. It makes no difference where you go, just so you go, go, go. Remember, at the first opportunity, go. That's Rankin. However, that first opportunity to go took several years to materialize. Like many other first-generation female college graduates, Rankin initially struggled to find her place in the world. Careers in science were still very limited for women, and when Rankin earned her bachelor's degree in biology, she confessed she was not prepared to do anything, or at least not anything that anyone would hire her to do. A short stint as a country school teacher was cut short by her father's death in 1904. At that point, like many other unmarried older sisters of her generation, Rankin answered the family claim and spent the next several years caring for her widowed mother and her younger siblings. Finally, in 1908, at the age of 28, she finally left home to study at the New York School of Philanthropy, the nation's first school of social work. However, Rankin was unhappy with what she described as a Band-Aid approach to social problems. She soon turned her attention from social work to social reform, joining the successful Washington State campaign for woman suffrage in 1910. It was through her work with the suffrage movement that Rankin first came into contact with the feminist pacifist movement, organized in the United States in 1915 as the Women's Peace Party. As she later recalled, she had always regarded women's suffrage and feminist pacifism as being intrinsically linked. One of the first things we talked about in women's suffrage, she said, was that it was women's job to get rid of war. As the field secretary for NASA, Rankin conducted campaigns on behalf of women's suffrage in more than 15 states, including her home state of Montana, between 1911 and 1914, in a car just like this one. So she finally got her chance to go. 2 years after a failed attempt to pass a suffrage measure in her home state, Rankin returned to Montana in 1914 to campaign in every county in the state, traveling 1,300 miles in 25 days. This time, her determination coincided with a reform impulse in the state, and the suffrage measure carried 41,302 votes to 35,588 votes, making Montana the 11th state to adopt women's suffrage by a margin of less than 6,000 votes. 2 years after that campaign, in 1916, Rankin was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, becoming, in her words, a symbol and a representative, not only of women in Montana or in the United States, but of women in all nations and all ages. Much to her disappointment, however, it was war and not women's rights that preoccupied national politics when she took office in 1917. Women's suffrage, she insisted, was a step that must be taken if we are to solve with justice the questions that come before us daily. The day after President Wilson's war speech, she reintroduced the National Woman Suffrage Amendment in Congress, asking, "How shall we explain the meaning of democracy if the same Congress that voted for war to make the world safe for democracy refuses to give this small measure of democracy to the women of our country?" 4 days later, on April the 6th, 1917, Rankin cast her first vote in Congress against U.S. entry into the war. Although on this occasion Rankin was not the only U.S. representative wary of involvement in the European War, 56 other members of Congress also voted against joining the belligerents, the backlash, especially in her home state, was immediate and severe. Rankin's office was flooded with telegrams and letters from angry Montanans who accused her of a lack of patriotism, a lack of courage, and perhaps most of all, a lack of manly resolve. Some said that she had damaged the cause of women's suffrage by demonstrating that without what Rankin's brother called the man's vote, and she called men's war habits, women simply did not have what it took for national government. Once the U.S. entered the war over her objections, Rankin attempted to ameliorate its effects by proposing a House resolution that provided pensions for dependents of American soldiers. Also during her first term in Congress, Rankin drafted the first version of what would ultimately become the Shepherd Counter Act, which provided federal matching funds for prenatal and infant care clinics in poor rural neighborhoods in the 1920s. She also, of course, supported the federal woman suffrage amendment, which was adopted in 1920. From World War I forward, Rankin refused to allow others' opposition to undermine her own convictions, even though she understood that working for peace would subject her, as it did other pacifists, to what she called the most painful consequence of all: the loss of social approval. Like many other feminist pacifists, Rankin believed that women's efforts were indispensable to universal disarmament and international understanding. In the 1920s, she declared, "The peace problem is a woman's problem. Peace is a woman's job." Like many of her contemporaries, Rankin adopted the notion of maternalism as a basis for political activism, believing that women, as mothers or potential mothers, had a special interest in ensuring world peace in the interest of protecting life. The motherhood of the world must demand that destruction be stopped, she asserted. On the other hand, Rankin's critique of war as a money-making venture was less common at the time and anticipated later activist denunciation of what would become known as the military-industrial complex. Both Rankin's forward thinking about the economic underpinnings of war and her later adoption of Gandhi's principles of non-resistance allowed her to remain at the forefront of American pacifism until her death in 1973. In addition to holding membership in the Women's Peace Party, which later became the U.S. chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF, Rankin also belonged to many other peace organizations, which were legion in the 1930s, including the National Committee on the Cause and Cure of War, and the Women's Peace Union, which attempted to outlaw war through a constitutional amendment. This was unsuccessful. When she briefly returned to Congress in 1940, she once again found herself embroiled in controversy when she voted against U.S. entry into World War II. Undaunted, she dedicated the rest of her life to promoting disarmament, exposing the economic motivations for warfare, and opposing U.S. involvement in military activities. In 1967, she led the Jeanette Rankin Brigade on a march on the nation's capital to protest the war in Vietnam. Today, Missoula's local chapter of WILPF, the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, is named in Rankin's honor. And local activists like the Women in Black continue to be inspired by Rankin's words. "I am still convinced that women can prevent war if they put their minds on it." Hazel Hunkins was a very different kind of activist. Hazel Hunkins was born on June 6, 1890 in Aspen, Colorado. Her family moved to Billings, Montana in 1903. Hunkins had a tenacious mind and quickly rose to become the top student in her class at Billings Senior High. She also had a memorable personality. When she graduated in 1908, she was voted most popular, second smartest, and third most conceited. In the early 20th century, women were attending college and even graduate school in increasing numbers. Hunkins joined this cohort of new women by studying chemistry, first at one of the nation's first women's colleges, Vassar, and then entering a graduate program in chemistry at a coeducational state university, the University of Missouri. However, when she tried to become either a professional chemist, that is like in the industrial world, or a chemistry teacher, her applications for employment were rejected because she was a woman. Like many of her generation, Hunkins found that while opportunities for higher education were opening up for women, career opportunities remained limited. At the same time, like many unmarried daughters, Hunkins felt bound by what her contemporary Jane Addams called the family claim, and returned to Billings to care for her elderly mother. Hunkins began her lifelong career in organized feminism when she joined the National Woman's Party. The National Woman's Party, or NWP, was founded in 1913 by suffrage activists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The National Woman's Party split off from the much larger and more mainstream National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, over a disagreement in methods. The National Woman's Party was generally recognized as the more militant of the two, favoring huge marches and massive demonstrations in favor of a national suffrage amendment, while NASA lobbied at the state level for suffrage amendments. Jeanette Rankin, of course, had been associated with NASA's state campaign in Montana, although she also favored the federal suffrage amendment. However, despite the success of the state-by-state campaign in several western states, the eastern states were very slow to adopt suffrage, and the National Woman's Party wanted more immediate results. Hunkins and her fellow NWP members became famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to, for their fateful decision in 1917. When Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany and made the U.S. a belligerent in World War I, many suffrage activists turned their attention from women's suffrage to war service. Indeed, NASA officially committed itself to war service, believing that this would help prove that American women deserved the vote as a return for their patriotic action during the war. The National Woman's Party disagreed. They refused to stop their activities, and even more contentious, they decided to picket the White House. Here's Hunkins at the head of an aisle of picketers. Picketing the White House of a wartime president scandalized many Americans. When the first women marched out to stand in front of the gates, they were met with jeers and shouts. Their banners, which were sewn in the suffrage tricolors of white, gold, and purple, were ripped from their hands. Police looked on but did not intervene, even when a woman attacked Hunkins directly. Both women were later arrested. From June 1917 to early 1918, the National Woman's Party's pickets rarely left their stations at the White House. They rotated shifts and stood on warmed bricks in winter. They sewed new banners to replace those destroyed by passers-by. While the police originally declined to intervene, officers eventually started arresting the picketers on the charge of obstructing traffic. In court, the picketers refused to pay their fines, saying they were not subject to American law because they lacked the rights of full citizenship. Hunkins reportedly told the court, "Women cannot be law breakers until they are law makers." She refused to yield her American flag and was marched out of the courtroom still holding it aloft. In 1918, the National Woman's Party escalated efforts to convince Wilson to support suffrage. They began burning his speeches and criticizing his foreign policy, as well as to carry a number of signs mocking the president's wartime speeches. Like here, and here, and since you probably can't read that, President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy. President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. He is responsible for the disfranchisement of millions of Americans. We in America know this. The world will find him out. Picketers also carried signs describing Wilson as Kaiser Wilson, who of course is who we're at war against. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. In addition to picketing the White House in the daytime, at night, suffrage pickets would sneak wood out to their stations and publicly burn Wilson's speeches. Hunkins took particular charge of keeping what she called the watchfires of liberty burning, remaining stationed at a statue of Lafayette, pictured here, whenever she was not in prison. Long called the Silent Sentinels by the press, the suffrage picketers earned a new nickname in the Occoquan workhouse, the federal prison to which they were sentenced for obstructing traffic. Upon their arrival, they demanded to be treated as political prisoners rather than as criminals. And when their demands were not met, the women went on hunger strike. Despite force feeding and threats, they remained steadfast and earned their second and now much more famous nickname, the Iron-Jawed Angels. Many, including Hunkins, ultimately left the workhouse too weak to walk. Hunkins eagerly participated in the hunger strikes. She was arrested over 36 times during the course of the strikes and sustained many injuries both in and out of jail, including a fractured wrist. But she never faltered in her commitment to women's suffrage. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified by the final necessary state on August the 18th, 1920, the headquarters of the NWP erupted in celebration. Later that year, Hunkins moved to London, England, home of the militant suffrage movement, where Alice Paul had originally learned her confrontational tactics. Late in her life, Hunkins returned to the United States. In 1977, she marched through the streets of Houston, Texas, in honor of the National Women's Conference. At the time, she was 87 years old. She's the one with the purse. Earlier that year, she had been a guest at the White House, where 60 years before, she had been arrested. President Carter signed a Women's Equality Day proclamation and offered her the pen. He acknowledged, although we've come a long way since then, we still have a long way to go. Hunkins probably would have agreed, but most importantly, she would have stressed the importance of women working together to make change. Recalling her work with the National Woman's Party, she reflected, it was a completely cooperative community. We all addressed envelopes. We all stuffed envelopes. We all answered the doorbells. It was no 8-hour-a-day or 9-to-5 job. It was early morning till midnight, but we all did it. We all did it. Okay, anyone here from the Bitterroot? This is our local Bitterroot heroine. Okay, so Maggie Hathaway was a contemporary of Jeanette Rankin's, who has not achieved the same level of name recognition, but who I have always thought, ever since I moved to Montana, was a truly fascinating character. One of the women in black who was a descendant of hers introduced me to her by showing me her scrapbook when I first moved here, almost 20 years ago now, and I still think she's fascinating. Okay, so this is Maggie Hathaway. Hathaway exemplified women's community building work as a teacher, a temperance advocate, and a reformer with special interests in civic improvement and child welfare. Hathaway had been born in 1867 in Ottawa, Ohio, not Canada. She came to Stevensville, Montana in 1893 when her father, a Methodist minister, accepted a position there. Hathaway took inspiration from her family. In addition to her minister father, she admired her mother, who was a school teacher. And Hathaway, from an early age, took leadership roles wherever she went, including several social reform organizations, such as the Epworth League, which was a Methodist women's group, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which advocated prohibition as a way to address domestic violence. Hathaway wanted to improve the lives of her fellow citizens, and she pursued this commitment through the fight for suffrage and beyond. Like many women who eventually became involved in politics and reform, Hathaway began her career in public life as a schoolteacher, accepting her first teaching job at the age of 15. She soon became principal of the school near Stevensville and served as county superintendent of schools in Helena, thus following in Helen Clark's footsteps. In the late 19th century, teaching school was one of the few respectable jobs available to an unmarried woman. Since many Americans believed that women were uniquely suited to raising children, if they did not have children of their own, it was acceptable for women to work in professions which involved caring for children, such as teaching, nursing, and social work. When Hathaway married in 1911, she was already a distinguished career woman with an established reputation in the state. Many school districts fired women school teachers when they got married. Whether or not this would have happened to Hathaway, we will never know, because her husband died barely 6 months after their wedding day. As a widow, Hathaway dedicated herself to reform. An eager member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, she committed herself to the cause of women's suffrage, as did many prohibition advocates. Like many other activists at the time, Hathaway argued for social housekeeping. As voters, she suggested women would clean up society just as women were responsible for caring for their own homes. Hathaway believed that women would be more inclined to vote against issues such as gambling, prostitution, and alcohol, and for issues such as child protective laws, city improvement, and community infrastructure. To get there, however, they first had to have the vote. In order to aid the suffrage campaign, Hathaway joined other networks of organizers, including the National American Woman Suffrage Association organizer Jeanette Rankin. This was not an easy relationship for them, incidentally. Hathaway reported that the state WCTU, of which she was a member, was willing to fund a stumping tour so that she, Hathaway, could speak on behalf of women's suffrage. Rankin, however, was worried that male voters would not support suffrage if it was linked too closely to prohibition, especially in a western hard-drinking state like Montana. So she asked Hathaway not to mention the WCTU in any of her speeches. The WCTU then refused to fund the trip. Hathaway, rather than yielding to either side, funded her own travels with the proceeds of her farm in Stevensville. Hathaway was second only to Rankin in her travels across the state, earning the nicknames the Montana Hummer and the Whirlwind during her statewide campaign for suffrage. By the time her statewide tour ended, the Anaconda Standard reported that she had traveled 5,379 miles between early June and November. She visited all but 2 county seats. Only Jeanette Rankin traveled more. In November 1914, Hathaway noted with great pride that when Election Day ballots were returned, her home county, Ravalli County, passed the suffrage referendum by the largest margin. Oh, how things have changed in Ravalli County. Not one to rest on her laurels, Hathaway seized the opportunity to run for state legislature. Her campaign, as you can see here, was based on a workable farm loan law, efficiency and economy in government, more attention to child welfare, an 8-hour workday, and, naturally, prohibition. Hathaway also was credited with helping to pass the state's first equal guardianship law, granting mothers custody rights, and the state's mother's pension law, which provided financial support, direct cash financial support to single mothers. Hathaway, who was petite and redheaded, which unfortunately does not come through in historic images, quickly gained a reputation as the biggest man in the house, despite weighing only 115 pounds. She was re-elected in both 1918 and 1920. And in 1920, she was elected minority floor leader, becoming the first woman in the nation to hold that position. Hathaway was a very popular and effective legislator. Her fellow lawmakers, male, joked that her name should be Mrs. Has Her Way instead of Mrs. Hathaway, but they always added, "It is a good way." One reason for Hathaway's success was that unlike Rankin, who drew condemnation for her pacifism, Hathaway earned praise from her fellow Montanans by eagerly committing to the war effort. Newspapers ran features on the woman from Montana who built her own apple crates on her family farm, rather than relying on manpower better used elsewhere. There are fantastic headlines about the manless farm. She also gained acclaim for her legislative actions, which, in addition to the things I've already mentioned, included keeping minors out of gambling halls. And in 1919, she passed the nation's first equal pay for equal work law in Montana.
Wow.
After a failed bid for a national seat in Congress, Hathaway was appointed to head the Montana Children's Bureau, and she served the Children's Bureau from 1925 to 1937. The Children's Bureau was funded in part by federal contributions and was charged with bringing health care and social services to rural citizens. Hathaway brought to this office her usual drive and compassion, and in the first 2 years alone, she oversaw the cases of 3,334 children. During Hathaway's tenure with the State Children's Bureau, Montana, like most other states in the nation, provided mothers' pensions to allow children from poverty-stricken families to remain at home under their mother's care rather than being sent to institutions. In 1935, with the adoption of the Social Security Act under the New Deal, these programs were incorporated into the Federal Aid to Dependent Children program, later renamed Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. This program, originally enacted in 1935, with state variants of it as early as 1911, remained in effect until welfare reform in 1996. For nearly 4 decades, Hathaway played an important role in education, suffrage, moral reform, and the development of the welfare state in Montana. Our objective, she would later recall, is to keep people out of trouble, to help them to help themselves. Hathaway embodied her own advice. For her, suffrage was only the beginning. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this profile of 4 rather different activists from the suffrage era in Montana. If you would like to know more, I encourage you to visit the website created by Martha Cole and Kayla Blackman at the Montana Historical Society, www.montanawomen'shistory.org, which features more than 100 profiles of individuals and organizations who worked to serve their communities and to advance the interests of women, children, and other disadvantaged groups. So, at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes?
Would you also like to give a plug for your Molly class coming up?
Oh, sure, I could do that. Right, yes, and also I'm, for the second time through the Molly program, which if you have not checked out and you're over 55, oh my gosh, it is so cool. I can hardly wait to be 55 so I can take classes there. I'm teaching a class on women's activism and human rights in the U.S., which will begin in the 1830s and come up to the present. So we'll look at abolitionism, which I talked about here a little bit last year. We'll look at the anti-lynching movement. We'll also look at the development of the welfare state, pacifism, progressivism, some of the same things we talked about here, and then move forward to the civil rights movement and the modern women's rights movement as well. I forgot to mention suffrage. It's obviously in there too. You probably figured that out by now. And I think it starts the 22nd of January. So you can sign up on UM's website. Thank you for asking. It's pretty fun. Any other questions or comments?
No.
Yes?
My husband's on the bridge with Women in Black, and he founded Veterans for Peace here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one of the one of the kind of fun facts, right, about Rankin is we all know that she voted no against entry into World War I, but I have never met, I rarely meet people who know that she also sponsored a bill to provide pensions for the families of people in military service, right? So she's a really good, early example of how being in favor of peace does not mean that you're opposed to the individuals who serve in the military, which I think is always kind of cool when you can find a really early example like that. All right, thank you very much for coming, and if you have any other questions, I can answer them one-on-one. Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Thank you all for coming and for braving the parking situation outside. As I mentioned before, this lecture is part of a series that we have, a monthly lecture series called YWCA Talks, and which is geared towards providing the Missoula community with a space to discover and exchange information about topics that pertain to women and those of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. Next month, our series is going to twist a little bit. Rather than having a straight lecture, we are planning to talk a little bit about the YWCA's new advocacy project. We're kind of dipping our toes into some of this policy work that our four sisters took on, and we are looking at a couple of different focus areas. We have 4 different focus areas, bullying, pay equity, immigration, and human trafficking. Thanks, Cindy. So we'll have some short presentations from folks on our advocacy committee, and then we'll open it up for kind of a public discussion forum. So we're really excited about that. We're having a legislative luncheon, so sort of a meet and greet with our new legislators, that's going to be closed just because of time and space. But we really wanted to make sure that we took these issues to the community and got your input on how we can serve women and families in the advocacy purview. So please tell all your friends about that. That's likely going to be January 23rd, although we haven't set the date down to confirm that yet. But please join us next month for that. And thank you again to Anya for sharing your expertise with us today. It's great.